Daniel Reyes had everything that most people only dreamed about. At 42 years old, he owned one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the country. His trucks traveled across provinces every day, delivering goods from warehouses to markets, factories, and ports. The company that once started with a single second-hand truck had now grown into a business worth millions. Yet, despite the success, Daniel had never forgotten where he came from. He grew up in a small house with a leaking roof and thin wooden walls. His parents worked endlessly just to provide food for the family. Daniel remembered nights when the electricity was cut because they could not pay the bills. Back then, he promised himself that one day he would change their lives. And he did. Through hard work, patience, and many sleepless nights, Daniel slowly built his company from the ground up. He drove trucks himself in the early days. Sometimes he even slept inside the vehicle during long deliveries. When the business began growing, he hired drivers, then staff, then managers. Year after year, the company expanded until Daniel finally became known as one of the most successful businessmen in the region. But success came with a strange kind of loneliness. When Daniel first became wealthy, relatives he had not seen for years suddenly started appearing in his life again. Cousins who once ignored him began visiting his house. Distant uncles started calling him regularly. Family gatherings became more frequent, and Daniel always welcomed them warmly. He believed that helping family was the right thing to do. Over the years, he paid for hospital bills, school tuition, and even house renovations for several relatives. Whenever someone needed financial help, Daniel rarely refused. For a long time, he believed their gratitude was genuine. But lately, something had begun to bother him. It started with small things. During dinners, Daniel noticed that some relatives spoke more about his wealth than about his well-being. Instead of asking how he was feeling, they asked about his investments, his company profits, or the properties he owned. Sometimes they joked about who would inherit the business someday. At first, Daniel laughed along with them, thinking they were only teasing. But deep inside, the jokes slowly began to feel uncomfortable. One evening, Daniel hosted a large family gathering at his spacious home. The dining table was filled with food, and the house echoed with laughter and conversation. Everyone seemed happy. Music played softly in the background while relatives enjoyed the evening. After dinner, Daniel quietly stepped away from the table to get some fresh air outside. As he walked down the hallway toward the garden, he suddenly heard voices coming from the living room. The voices belonged to two of his cousins and an uncle. Daniel stopped walking when he heard his own name mentioned. He did not mean to eavesdrop, but the conversation immediately caught his attention. One cousin chuckled softly before speaking. "Daniel doesn't even have children. When the time comes, the company will probably stay in the family anyway." Another voice responded with a laugh. "Exactly, and with the kind of money he has now, whoever ends up managing his business will live comfortably for the rest of their life." The uncle added in a quieter tone, "We just need to stay close to him. When the time comes, things will fall into place." The three of them laughed. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway. For several seconds, he could not move. A strange heaviness settled in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. These were people he had trusted, people he had helped many times over the years. Yet the way they spoke about him sounded less like family and more like opportunists waiting for something. Daniel slowly stepped back, making sure his footsteps were silent. He returned to the garden, but the peaceful night air did nothing to calm his thoughts. He stared at the dark sky for a long time. Questions began filling his mind. Did they really care about him, or were they simply waiting for the wealth he had built? Had their kindness all these years been genuine, or had it only been an act? The more Daniel thought about it, the more unsettled he became. Over the following days, the memory of that conversation continued haunting him. Every smile from a relative suddenly felt suspicious. Every compliment sounded less sincere. Daniel realized something painful. Money had changed the way people treated him, and for the first time in his life, Daniel began to wonder if anyone around him truly cared about him as a person, not just as a wealthy man. That's when an unusual idea slowly formed in his mind. If people believed he was powerful and successful, they would always treat him with respect. But what if he suddenly became weak? What if he appeared helpless? Would they still care about him, or would their true intentions finally reveal themselves? The thought stayed with him for days, until it finally turned into a plan, a shocking plan. Daniel Reyes decided that the only way to know the truth about the people around him was to remove the one thing that made them treat him differently: his power, his wealth, and the strength they believed he possessed. Daniel Reyes decided he would pretend to lose his eyesight. He would become a blind man, and through that act, he would discover who truly cared about him and who was only waiting for the moment he could no longer see. The plan began quietly. Daniel Reyes did not tell anyone about it at first. For several days, he carefully prepared everything, making sure that every detail would look believable. If he wanted to uncover the truth about the people around him, the act had to be perfect. One afternoon, Daniel drove to a private medical clinic owned by an old friend, Dr. Victor Santos. The two of them had known each other for many years, long before Daniel became successful. Victor had helped Daniel during some difficult times in the past, and Daniel trusted him completely. When Daniel explained his plan, the doctor stared at him in disbelief. "You want to pretend that you've gone blind?" Victor asked slowly. Daniel nodded. "I need to know who truly cares about me," he replied calmly. "For years, I've helped everyone in my family, but lately I feel like they only see my money." Victor leaned back in his chair, thinking carefully. "This is not a simple test," the doctor said. "If you do this, people's true characters might really appear, and you might not like what you discover." Daniel gave a faint smile. "I already suspect the truth," he said quietly. "I just need confirmation." After a long pause, Victor finally agreed to help him. Together, they created a believable story. According to the plan, Daniel would suddenly suffer from a rare neurological condition that caused permanent blindness. The diagnosis would appear official, and Victor would confirm it to anyone who asked. To make the act convincing, Daniel even practiced moving around with limited vision. He learned how to walk slowly, how to reach for objects carefully, and how to appear disoriented when navigating his own home. For several nights, he rehearsed the role alone. Each step had to look real. Finally, the day came when Daniel decided to begin the act. Early one morning, Daniel called his younger sister Maria and asked her to come to the house immediately. His voice sounded weak and anxious over the phone. When Maria arrived, she found Daniel sitting in the living room, holding his head. "What happened?" she asked worriedly. Daniel slowly looked up, his eyes slightly unfocused. "I woke up this morning and everything was blurry. Now I can barely see anything." Maria immediately panicked and insisted they go to the hospital. Within an hour, Daniel was inside Dr. Victor's clinic while several family members waited outside the examination room. The doctor performed a series of tests while Maria anxiously paced in the hallway. After nearly an hour, Victor finally stepped outside. His expression was serious. "I'm afraid the results are not good," he told them gently. Maria felt her heart sink. "What do you mean?" she asked worriedly. Victor sighed before answering. "It appears that Daniel has developed a rare condition affecting his optic nerves. At the moment, his vision has almost completely deteriorated." The words fell heavily in the quiet hallway. "Is there treatment?" one of Daniel's cousins asked nervously. Victor shook his head slowly. "We will continue observing him, but there is a possibility that the damage might be permanent." The room became silent. Maria covered her mouth as tears formed in her eyes. Inside the examination room, Daniel sat quietly while listening to the reaction outside. Although he could hear the concern in Maria's voice, he also noticed something else. Some relatives sounded shocked, but others remained strangely quiet. That afternoon, Daniel returned home with his dark glasses covering his eyes. Maria carefully guided him inside the house while several relatives followed behind. Daniel deliberately moved slowly, pretending that every step required effort. The house suddenly felt different. Earlier that week, it had been full of lively conversation and laughter. Now, the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. Family members whispered among themselves as Daniel sat on the living room couch. "I never imagined something like this could happen," one aunt murmured. "Poor Daniel," another relative said softly. For the first few hours, everyone seemed sympathetic. They offered help, asked if he needed water, and tried to comfort him. But as the evening progressed, Daniel began noticing small changes. Some relatives quickly returned to their conversations. Others seemed distracted. A few even left earlier than expected. Daniel sat quietly, pretending not to notice anything, while listening carefully to every voice in the room. Later that night, Maria helped him walk toward his bedroom. "You don't have to worry," she said gently. "We'll all help you get through this." Daniel nodded slowly. "Thank you." After Maria left the room, Daniel sat alone on the edge of his bed. The first stage of his plan had begun. Tomorrow he would begin distancing himself from the daily operations of his company. His relatives would gradually believe that he could no longer manage the business properly. And once that happened, Daniel knew something important would begin to reveal itself. People behave differently when they think someone has become weak. For the first time in his life, Daniel Reyes was now living as a blind man. And while everyone believed he could no longer see the world around him, Daniel was quietly watching something far more important. He was watching how people would treat him when they thought he had nothing left to offer. The days after Daniel's supposed blindness began quietly, but little by little, the atmosphere inside the house started to change. At first, the family continued treating him with sympathy. They spoke softly around him and offered help whenever he tried to stand or move around. Maria stayed by his side most of the time, guiding him from room to room and making sure he ate properly. But as the days passed, Daniel began noticing subtle differences in the way people behaved. Because they believed he could no longer see, many of them stopped hiding their true expressions. Daniel listened carefully to every movement, every tone of voice, and every whisper that filled the house. One morning, he slowly walked toward the dining area, using a cane Maria had given him. He moved cautiously, pretending to struggle with each step. When he reached the table, two of his cousins were already there. "Good morning," Daniel said calmly. One of them replied quickly, but the tone sounded impatient. "Morning." Daniel sat down carefully while feeling the table surface with his hands. "Could someone pass me the water?" he asked. There was a short silence. Then one cousin sighed quietly before sliding the glass toward him. "Here," he said. Daniel felt the glass touch his hand. "Thank you," Daniel replied politely. The cousin did not answer. Instead, Daniel heard a chair scrape loudly against the floor as the cousin stood up. "I need to go out," the man muttered before leaving the room. Daniel remained seated, holding the glass of water. Although his face remained calm, his thoughts were becoming clearer with every passing day. The kindness he had once received was slowly disappearing. Later that afternoon, Daniel was resting in the living room when his cousin Adrian approached him. Adrian had always been one of the relatives who stayed closest to Daniel after his success. He often offered help with small business matters and frequently visited the house. Now, his voice sounded unusually enthusiastic. "Daniel, I was thinking about something," Adrian said. Daniel slowly turned his head toward the sound of his voice. "What is it?" he asked. "Well," Adrian continued, "since your condition makes it difficult for you to handle business matters now, maybe someone should temporarily help oversee some of the company finances." Daniel remained quiet. Adrian quickly continued speaking. "I mean, just until you recover or until things stabilize." Daniel carefully nodded as if considering the idea. "And who do you think should manage that?" he asked calmly. Adrian chuckled softly. "Well, I do have some experience in business. I could help monitor the accounts and make sure everything runs smoothly." Daniel pretended to think about it for a moment. "That might be helpful," he replied slowly. "The company does need supervision." Adrian sounded pleased. "Exactly. You can trust me with that. We're family after all." Daniel nodded slightly. "All right, you can start reviewing some of the financial reports." Adrian immediately agreed. "Perfect. I'll handle it." As Adrian walked away, Daniel remained sitting quietly in the living room. The moment Adrian disappeared down the hallway, Daniel's expression slowly changed. Even without seeing Adrian's face, Daniel could clearly hear the excitement in his voice. That evening, Daniel stayed in his bedroom while pretending to sleep. Outside the door, voices quietly echoed from the hallway. Two relatives were speaking. One of them was Adrian. "So Daniel already agreed?" someone asked. "Of course," Adrian replied with a laugh. "He barely understands what's happening now." The other person chuckled. "Well, if he can't manage the company anymore, someone has to." Adrian lowered his voice slightly. "And if we play this right, we could eventually control more than just the finances." Both of them laughed quietly. Inside the room, Daniel lay still on the bed. His hands slowly tightened into fists. The conversation confirmed what he had begun to suspect. His blindness had already changed the way people treated him. Before, they spoke to him with respect and caution. Now, they spoke about him as if he were no longer capable of protecting what he had built. The following days brought even more changes. Some relatives started avoiding him when he asked for assistance. When he walked through the house with his cane, conversations often stopped abruptly as soon as he approached. Once, while asking for help finding the staircase, one cousin responded with visible irritation. "Can't someone else help him?" the cousin muttered quietly. Daniel pretended not to hear it, But inside, every word was carefully recorded in his mind. Each moment was another piece of truth slowly revealing itself. Daniel had spent years believing that family loyalty was stronger than money. Now he was beginning to see something different. Sometimes wealth did not bring people closer. Sometimes it only attracted those waiting for an opportunity. And now that Daniel appeared weak and helpless, those opportunities were beginning to show themselves. But the test had only just begun. Daniel knew that what he had witnessed so far was only the surface. Soon, the real intentions of the people around him would reveal themselves even more clearly. As the weeks passed, Daniel slowly adjusted to the role he had chosen to play. Every morning, he moved carefully around the house with his cane, pretending to depend on others for even the simplest tasks. At first, it felt strange to act helpless inside the very home he had built, but over time, the routine became natural. What never became easy, however, was hearing how differently people treated him now. Some relatives had already stopped hiding their impatience. When Daniel asked for help walking to the dining room or finding something on the table, he could sometimes hear sighs or reluctant footsteps before anyone responded. Their voices had also changed. The warmth that used to be there was slowly fading. But not everyone behaved the same way. One person in the house never changed her attitude toward him. Her name was Aling Rosa. She had been working in Daniel's home for nearly 15 years. When Daniel's company was still small and the house itself was not as large as it was now, Rosa had already been there, quietly taking care of the daily chores. She was already in her late 60s, with silver hair always tied in a neat bun and a soft but firm voice that carried both kindness and strength. Unlike the others, Rosa never seemed uncomfortable around Daniel. Every morning, she greeted him the same way she always had. "Good morning, Sir Daniel," she would say gently while placing breakfast on the table. One morning, Daniel slowly made his way to the kitchen, tapping his cane lightly on the floor. Before he could even ask for help, Rosa was already beside him. "Careful, sir. The chair is right here," she said while guiding his hand to the back of the chair. "Thank you, Rosa," Daniel replied. She carefully placed a bowl of warm soup in front of him. "You should eat while it's still hot," she said. Daniel slowly lifted the spoon, pretending to search for the bowl before dipping it inside. As he ate, Rosa quietly stood nearby. "You don't have to wait here," Daniel told her gently. "I can manage." Rosa shook her head. "It's all right, just in case you need something." Her voice carried the same sincerity it always had. Daniel felt a small heaviness in his chest. Among all the people inside the house, Rosa was the only one who treated him exactly the same as before. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat in the living room while listening to the television news. He could hear several relatives talking in the nearby dining area. One of them suddenly spoke in an irritated tone. "Why does he keep asking for help with everything now?" Another voice responded quietly. "Well, he's blind now. What do you expect?" The first person clicked their tongue. "I know, but it's exhausting. The whole house feels different." Daniel remained seated without moving. He kept his expression calm, pretending not to hear anything. But Rosa heard them. A moment later, her footsteps echoed sharply across the room. "What are you saying?" Rosa asked firmly. The room fell silent. Nothing, one cousin replied quickly. Rosa did not sound convinced. Sir Daniel helped many of you when you needed it. He never complained when he paid hospital bills or school tuition. Now that he needs a little assistance, you're already tired? No one responded. The tension in the air was thick. After a moment, Rosa turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Daniel slowly lowered his head, pretending to focus on the sound of the television. Inside, he felt something he had not expected: gratitude. That evening, Rosa brought him a cup of warm tea before bedtime. "Here, sir," she said while placing the cup on the small table beside him. Daniel carefully reached for it. "Thank you, Rosa." She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sir Daniel, if you ever need someone to help you walk around the house or go outside, you can call me anytime." Daniel nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." Rosa gave a small smile before leaving the room. After the door closed, Daniel sat quietly in the darkness. He thought about everything that had happened since the beginning of his plan. Some relatives had already begun showing signs of greed. Others had grown impatient with him. Their sympathy had slowly faded once they realized his blindness might be permanent. But Rosa had never changed. She still treated him with the same kindness and respect she had shown for many years. The difference was impossible to ignore. Daniel realized something important. True loyalty rarely came from people who stayed close because of wealth or status. Sometimes it came from the quiet individuals who expected nothing in return. People like Rosa. And as the days continued to pass, Daniel knew that his test was revealing something deeper than he had originally planned. The masks people wore around him were slowly beginning to fall. And the more he listened, the more he began to see who truly cared about him and who was simply waiting for the moment he could no longer defend what was his. Several more weeks passed, and the quiet tension inside the house slowly grew heavier. Daniel continued living his daily routine as a blind man, carefully walking through the hallways with his cane and depending on others for small tasks. But what he was really doing each day was listening. Listening to every conversation, listening to every whisper, listening to the truth that people revealed when they believed he could no longer see. One evening, Daniel finished dinner earlier than the others and slowly made his way back toward the hallway leading to his bedroom. The house was unusually quiet, and most of the relatives were still gathered in the dining room behind him. As Daniel walked past the living room, he heard voices coming from the small study room near the back of the house. The door was slightly open. The voices inside sounded serious. Daniel stopped walking. He quietly positioned himself near the wall, making it appear as though he was simply trying to find his way toward the hallway. But in reality, he was listening carefully. Inside the study room, several familiar voices spoke in low tones. One of them was Adrian, another was Daniel's older cousin Marco, and there was also Daniel's aunt Lorna. Adrian spoke first. "We can't keep waiting forever," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Marco asked. "You've seen Daniel's condition." Adrian replied, "The doctor already said his blindness might be permanent. That means the company will eventually need someone else to run things." Marco sounded hesitant. "But Daniel is still the owner." Adrian chuckled softly. "For now." There was a brief silence. Then Aunt Morna spoke. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Adrian lowered his voice slightly. I'm saying we should start preparing for the future. If we move carefully, we could gradually sell some company shares and manage the money ourselves. Marco sounded surprised. You mean without Daniel knowing? Adrian sighed impatiently. He can't see the documents anyway, and he trusts us. If we tell him the business needs restructuring, he'll probably sign whatever papers we put in front of him. A faint laugh followed. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Inside the dark hallway, his grip on the cane slowly hardened. The conversation continued. We just need to make sure we control the financial accounts first. Once we manage that, the rest will be easy. And Daniel? Aunt Norna asked. Adrian responded calmly. He's already struggling to move around the house. Soon he'll depend on us for everything. Marco hesitated again. But what if he recovers somehow? Adrian shook his head. The doctor already explained that the damage is serious, and even if Daniel improves a little, it will take years. By that time, the company will already be under our control. The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Marco asked another question. What about the house and the other properties? Adrian's voice carried a hint of excitement. That's another thing we need to talk about. Daniel slowly turned his head toward the door as Adrian continued speaking. If Daniel becomes too difficult to manage here, we could convince him to move into a private care facility. Aunt Lorna gasped softly. You mean a nursing home? Yes, Adrian said calmly. We can tell him it's for his safety. Once he's there, managing his business and properties will become much easier. Marco sounded uncertain. That seems extreme. Adrian replied coldly, You want control of the company or not? The room became silent again. Then Marco finally spoke. I suppose it's better than letting everything collapse. Inside the hallway, Daniel stood completely still. The words echoed loudly in his mind. They were not just planning to take control of his company, they were planning to remove him from his own home. Slowly, carefully, as if he were nothing more than an obstacle. For the first time since starting his plan, Daniel felt a deep ache in his chest. These were people he had trusted for years, people he had helped countless times, and now they were discussing ways to quietly erase him from his own life. Inside the study room, Adrian spoke again. We need to move carefully, no sudden changes. If Daniel becomes suspicious, everything will fall apart. Aunt Lorna nodded. So what do we do first? Adrian answered immediately. I'll start handling more financial matters. Once Daniel signs a few documents, we'll slowly take control of the accounts. Marco sighed. I just hope he doesn't realize anything. Adrian laughed softly. He's blind. What could he possibly realize? Inside the hallway, Daniel slowly turned away from the door. His steps were calm and steady as he continued walking toward his bedroom. But inside his mind, everything had changed. What he had just heard was no longer suspicion. It was proof. Proof that some members of his own family were willing to betray him the moment they believed he had become weak. That night, Daniel sat quietly on the edge of his bed. The room was silent except for the faint sound of wind outside the window. For the first time since starting his plan, Daniel truly felt the weight of loneliness. Despite the large house and the many relatives living inside it, he had never felt more alone. But in that silence, Daniel also made a decision. He would continue the test, because if this is what they were already planning, then the truth he would uncover next might be even more shocking. The following days passed with an uneasy quiet inside the house. Daniel continued playing his role as the blind man who depended on everyone around him, but inside he was more alert than ever. What he had overheard in the study room had already changed the way he viewed the people in his own home. The laughter, the casual conversations, even the footsteps that echoed through the hallways now carried meanings he had never noticed before. Adrian had started visiting the house more frequently. Every morning he arrived carrying folders, documents, and a laptop, speaking confidently about company matters as if he were already part of the leadership. Whenever Daniel asked what he was doing, Adrian would calmly explain that he was only helping organize financial records. Daniel would simply nod and thank him, but every word Adrian spoke now sounded different to him. One afternoon, Daniel sat quietly in the living room while listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan above him. He could hear voices coming from the kitchen. Several relatives were gathered there again, talking in low tones. At first, Daniel did not pay much attention. Conversations like that had become common since his supposed blindness. But then one familiar voice rose above the others. It was Maria. Daniel's younger sister rarely raised her voice, but now she sounded upset. "What are you all talking about?" she asked sharply. The kitchen suddenly became quiet. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his seat, pretending to adjust his cane while listening carefully. Adrian spoke after a moment. "Maria, calm down. We're just discussing the future of the company." "The future of the company?" Maria repeated. "Daniel is still the owner." "Yes," Adrian replied calmly, "but his condition makes things complicated now." Maria's voice trembled with anger. "Complicated? He built that company from nothing. All of you know that." Another relative spoke up. "We're only trying to help. The business needs leadership." Maria did not sound convinced. "And who decided that leadership should come from you?" The tension inside the kitchen grew thicker. Adrian sighed. "Maria, you're being emotional. We're family. We only want to protect the business." Maria laughed bitterly. "Protect the business or take control of it?" There was a long silence. Daniel could almost imagine the uncomfortable looks being exchanged inside the kitchen. Adrian's voice lowered slightly. "You're misunderstanding the situation." "No," Maria replied firmly. "I understand perfectly." Daniel could hear the sound of footsteps as Maria moved closer to them. "I heard some of you talking last night about selling company shares and moving Daniel somewhere else." The room went completely silent. Someone tried to speak, but Maria continued before they could respond. "Do you think Daniel is useless now just because he can't see?" Her voice was filled with emotion. "For years he supported this entire family. When people needed help, he was always the first to give it. Now that he's the one struggling, you're already planning how to take advantage of him." Adrian's tone turned defensive. "You're exaggerating." "No, I'm telling the truth." Another relative attempted to calm the situation. "Maria, nobody is trying to hurt Daniel." But Maria's voice remained steady. "Then prove it." No one answered. After a moment, Maria continued speaking more quietly. "If any of you truly care about Daniel, you should be helping him recover, not discussing ways to take his company." Daniel felt a strange warmth inside his chest as he listened. Maria had always been close to him, but hearing her defend him so fiercely now was something he had never expected. Adrian finally spoke again. "We're only thinking about what's best for everyone." Maria replied immediately, "No, you're thinking about what's best for yourselves." The words hung heavily in the air. Then Maria's footsteps moved away from the group. "I won't be part of this," she said firmly. Daniel heard the kitchen door open and close. A moment later, Maria walked into the living room where Daniel was sitting. She stopped when she saw him. Daniel slowly turned his head toward her voice. "Maria, is everything all right?" Maria hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said softly, "everything is fine." Daniel nodded gently. "Good." Maria walked closer and sat beside him on the couch. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Maria finally said something in a quiet voice. "Daniel, if you ever feel like people are making decisions without your consent, you should tell me." Daniel slowly turned his face toward her. "Why do you say that?" Maria hesitated again. "Because sometimes people forget who really built everything." Daniel remained silent for a moment. Then he placed a hand gently over hers. "Thank you for looking out for me," he said calmly. Maria squeezed his hand. "I'll always be on your side." After she left the room, Daniel sat alone again in the quiet living room. The events of the afternoon replayed in his mind. For the first time since beginning his test, he felt something stronger than disappointment: hope. Because while some members of his family were already showing their greed, one person had chosen to stand up for him. Maria had defended him without knowing he could hear every word, and that meant her loyalty was genuine. But Daniel also understood something else now. If Adrian and the others were already planning to control the company, then the situation might soon become even more dangerous for the business he had spent his entire life building. The test was no longer just about discovering the truth. It was also about protecting everything he had worked so hard to create. The weeks that followed slowly revealed the consequences of decisions being made behind Daniel's back. While he continued pretending to live as a blind man inside his own home, the company he had built for decades was beginning to show signs of serious trouble. At first, the changes were small. Daniel occasionally heard Adrian speaking loudly on the phone in the study room, discussing shipments, contracts, and finances, as if he were already part of the executive management. Sometimes Adrian even brought unfamiliar people into the house, introducing them as consultants or financial advisors who were supposedly helping stabilize the company. Daniel always remained quiet when these conversations happened. But what Adrian did not know was that Daniel still received occasional visits from a few trusted employees who had worked with him for many years. One of them was Roberto, the operations manager who had been with the company since its early days. One afternoon, Roberto came to the house carrying several folders. Maria guided him into the living room where Daniel was sitting. "Sir Daniel," Roberto greeted him respectfully. Daniel slowly turned his head toward the voice. "Roberto? It's good to hear your voice." Roberto hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I know you've been resting." Daniel gave a small nod. "It's all right. Tell me what's going on." Roberto glanced briefly at Maria before answering. "Well, some employees are starting to worry." Daniel remained calm. "About what?" Roberto sighed. "There have been several management changes recently. Adrian has been giving orders to department supervisors, even though he's not officially part of the company leadership." Daniel pretended to think for a moment. "I did allow him to help with financial reports," he said slowly. "Yes, sir," Roberto replied carefully. but the decisions being made are starting to affect daily operations. Daniel kept his voice calm. What kind of decisions? Roberto opened one of the folders he brought. Several delivery contracts were suddenly canceled last week, he explained, and some suppliers haven't received payment yet. Maria looked surprised. What do you mean they haven't been paid? Roberto shook his head. We're not sure. The accounting department says some funds were moved into different accounts. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Did Adrian authorize those changes? He asked. Roberto nodded slowly. Yes, sir. He said it was part of a financial restructuring. Maria frowned a bit. That doesn't sound right. Roberto looked uneasy. Employees are beginning to feel uncertain. Some drivers are worried about delayed salaries if the situation continues. Daniel sat quietly, absorbing every word. The company he had built from the ground up was slowly beginning to destabilize, and the worst part was that the person making these decisions had no real understanding of the business. Adrian was only interested in gaining control. After Roberto finished explaining the situation, Daniel thanked him for the information and asked him to continue monitoring the company closely. Keep me updated whenever something unusual happens, Daniel said. Roberto nodded. I will, sir. After Roberto left, Maria remained sitting beside Daniel. This is getting serious, she said quietly. Daniel slowly placed both hands on his cane. Yes, he replied calmly. Maria leaned forward slightly. Maybe you should reveal the truth now, she suggested. If Adrian is already making these kinds of decisions, the company could suffer real damage. Daniel remained silent for a moment. He understood Maria's concern. The situation was clearly becoming dangerous for the business. But something inside him told him the test was not finished. There are still things I need to understand, he said quietly. Maria looked at him with concern. What do you mean? Daniel slowly turned his face toward her voice. I need to know how far they are willing to go. Maria sighed softly but did not argue further. That evening, the tension inside the house felt heavier than usual. Adrian and several relatives gathered again inside the study room while discussing company matters. Daniel sat quietly in the living room, listening to their voices through the slightly open door down the hallway. Adrian sounded confident. Once we reorganize the accounts, everything will stabilize. One relative asked nervously, but what if employees start questioning the changes? Adrian laughed. They won't, and even if they do, Daniel won't know anything about it. Another voice joined the conversation. Do you think he suspects something? Adrian shook his head. He can barely walk around the house without help. The last thing he's thinking about is business management. The group chuckled quietly. In the living room, Daniel remained completely still. Each word only confirmed what he had already begun to realize. Adrian and the others were not just making careless decisions. They were slowly pushing the company towards collapse, not because they intended to destroy it, but because their greed blinded them to the responsibilities of leadership. For the first time since starting his plan, Daniel began to feel genuine concern. This was no longer only a test of loyalty. The company he had spent his entire life building was now at risk. And if Adrian continued managing things this way, the damage might soon become irreversible. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. The house was quiet again, but his thoughts were louder than ever. He knew something important now. The moment to reveal the truth was getting closer. But before that moment arrived, Daniel needed to uncover every detail of the betrayal happening around him, because the next steps he would take would decide not only the future of his family, but also the survival of the company that carried his name. By the time another week passed, Daniel understood that the situation could no longer continue the way it was. What had started as a quiet test of loyalty had slowly turned into something far more serious. The company he built with years of sacrifice was already beginning to suffer under the careless decisions of people who had no real understanding of the business. But Daniel still remained patient. Every night he replayed the conversations he had overheard in his mind. Adrian's confidence, the quiet agreement of the other relatives, their belief that he had become helpless. They truly believed he could no longer see what was happening. That belief was exactly what gave Daniel the advantage. One evening after dinner, Maria quietly entered Daniel's room and closed the door behind her. "Daniel," she said softly, "someone is here to see you." Daniel slowly raised his head. "Who is it?" Maria hesitated before answering. "Mr. Alvarez, your lawyer." Daniel felt a quiet sense of relief. He had asked Maria earlier to arrange the visit, but he had not expected it to happen so quickly. "Please let him in," Daniel said calmly. A moment later, an older man stepped into the room. His footsteps were steady and familiar. "Good evening, Daniel," Mr. Alvarez greeted him. Daniel nodded slightly. "Thank you for coming." Maria quietly left the room to give them privacy. Once the door closed, Mr. Alvarez spoke in a lower voice. "I assume you called me because something serious is happening." Daniel leaned slightly forward. "Yes." For the first time since beginning his plan, Daniel spoke openly. "I'm not blind," he said calmly. There was a brief silence. Mr. Alvarez did not sound shocked. "I suspected as much," the lawyer replied. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "You did?" Mr. Alvarez chuckled softly. "You're not the kind of man who would surrender control of his life so easily." Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "You know me well." Then his expression became serious again. "I started this test because I wanted to know how people around me would behave if they believed I had become weak." Mr. Alvarez nodded slowly. "And what have you discovered?" Daniel exhaled quietly. "More than I expected." He then explained everything he had heard during the past several weeks. The conversations in the study room, Adrian's plan to take control of the finances, the discussions about selling company shares, even the suggestion of placing Daniel in a private care facility so they could manage everything without interference. The lawyer listened carefully. When Daniel finished speaking, Mr. Alvarez leaned back in his chair. "That is a very serious situation," he said. Daniel nodded. "And it gets worse." He reached toward a small drawer beside his bed and removed a small device. "I've been recording some of their conversations." Mr. Alvarez looked impressed. That was a wise precaution. Daniel placed the recorder on the table between them. "These recordings contain enough evidence to prove that they were planning to manipulate company assets without my consent." The lawyer thought for a moment. "With this evidence, you can legally protect the company and prevent any unauthorized transfers," he said. Daniel nodded again. "But I want to do more than that." The lawyer waited. "I want them to reveal everything," Daniel continued. "Not just in secret conversations, but in front of everyone. Mr. Alvarez slowly understood. You're going to expose their intentions publicly. Daniel's voice remained calm. Yes. Mr. Alvarez crossed his arms. And when do you plan to reveal the truth? Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Soon. The lawyer studied his expression carefully. The longer you wait, the more damage Adrian could cause. Daniel nodded. I know. Then he added quietly, that's why I've also contacted several trusted executives from the company. Mr. Alvarez raised his eyebrows. You have? Yes, Daniel replied. They've been monitoring the financial accounts closely. Adrian believes he's moving money around without anyone noticing, but every transaction is already documented. The lawyer gave a slow, approving nod. Very good. Daniel's voice lowered slightly. I want to gather everything. The recordings, the financial records, the witness statements. And then? The lawyer asked. Daniel's lips curved into a faint smile. Then I'll call a family meeting. Mr. Alvarez immediately understood. You're going to confront them. Daniel nodded. But not until I have every piece of proof. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Then Mr. Alvarez spoke again. You realize this will change your relationship with many members of your family. Daniel looked down at his hands. That change has already happened. The lawyer did not argue. Instead, he stood up and adjusted his coat. He said, I will begin preparing the legal documents. Daniel nodded gratefully. Thank you. After the lawyer left, Maria returned to the room. She sat beside Daniel and looked at him carefully. You're planning something, she said. Daniel slowly turned his face toward her. Yes. Maria studied him for a moment. Does it mean the truth will finally come out? Daniel gave a small nod. Very soon. Outside the window, the night air was calm, but inside the house, quiet tensions continued to grow. Adrian and the others believed they were slowly gaining control of everything Daniel owned. They believed the blind man sitting quietly in the house had no idea what they were doing. But what they did not realize is that every move they made was already being recorded. And soon the moment would come when the truth would be revealed to everyone. The following morning felt strangely calm, almost too calm for what Daniel was about to do. The house was quiet, except for the faint sounds of movement in the kitchen. Sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows, but Daniel remained seated in the living room, wearing the same dark glasses he had worn every day since the beginning of his plan. But this morning was different. After weeks of listening, observing, and collecting evidence, Daniel knew the moment had finally arrived. He slowly reached for his phone and dialed Adrian's number. Adrian answered almost immediately. Daniel, is everything all right? Daniel kept his voice calm and steady. Yes, I would like everyone in the house to gather in the living room this afternoon. I have something important to discuss. Adrian sounded curious. What kind of discussion? About the company, Daniel replied quietly. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Adrian answered confidently. Of course, I'll make sure everyone is there. Daniel ended the call and leaned back slightly in his chair. From the kitchen, Maria watched him carefully. Today? She asked softly. Daniel nodded. Yes. Maria took a deep breath. She had suspected this moment would come, but hearing it confirmed still made her nervous. The afternoon arrived slowly. One by one, the relatives gathered in the living room. Adrian arrived first, carrying several folders under his arm. Behind him came Marco, Aunt Lorna, and a few other family members who had been staying in the house for weeks. They all took seats around the room, whispering quietly to one another. Adrian stood near the coffee table, looking confident and relaxed. "So, Daniel," he said, "you mentioned something important about the company." Daniel slowly entered the room with his cane, moving carefully the way he always had. Maria guided him toward the large chair at the center of the room before quietly stepping aside. Everyone watched him. Daniel sat down slowly and rested his hands on the cane. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Adrian began speaking. "As everyone knows, Daniel's condition has made it difficult for him to manage the company personally," he said. "So, over the past few weeks, we've been reviewing the financial situation." Several relatives nodded as he continued. "There have been some challenges, but we're working on restructuring the business so it can continue operating smoothly." Marco added confidently, "The important thing is making sure the company stays stable." Another relative spoke up. "And of course, we'll make sure Daniel's interests are protected." Daniel remained silent as he listened. Their voices were calm and professional, but now that he knew the truth behind their plans, every word sounded empty. After Adrian finished explaining, he turned toward Daniel. "What do you think, Daniel?" Daniel slowly lifted his head. "I think it's good that everyone is here today," he said calmly. The relatives exchanged curious looks. Daniel continued speaking in the same quiet voice. "For the past several weeks, I have been hearing many discussions about the company." Adrian nodded. "Yes, we've been trying to handle things while you recover." Daniel paused for a moment. Then he slowly reached up and touched the dark glasses covering his eyes. "And that is exactly why I called this meeting." The room grew quieter. Daniel removed the glasses. For the first time in weeks, his eyes looked directly at everyone in the room. Several relatives froze instantly. Marco's mouth opened slightly in shock. Aunt Lorna gasped. Adrian's face turned pale. Daniel calmly placed the glasses on the table beside him. "I can see," he said quietly. No one spoke. The silence inside the living room felt heavy and overwhelming. Adrian finally managed to speak. What do you mean?" Daniel looked him directly. "I mean that I was never blind." The words seemed to echo through the room. Marco leaned forward in disbelief. "You're joking." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No." Aunt Lorna covered her mouth. "But the doctor said—" "The doctor helped me," Daniel replied calmly. Adrian's confidence began to crumble. "Why would you do something like this?" he demanded. Daniel remained calm. "Because I wanted to know the truth." The room fell silent again. Daniel continued speaking. "For years, I believed that the people around me cared about me because we were family." His eyes slowly moved across the room, looking at each of them. But I began to wonder if that was really the case. Adrian tried to interrupt. "Daniel, you're misunderstanding." Daniel raised his hand gently. "I heard the conversations in the study room." Adrian froze. Daniel's voice remained calm but firm. I heard the plans to sell company shares without my permission. Marco's face turned pale. And I heard the discussion about sending me to a care facility so you could manage everything without interference. Aunt Lorna slowly lowered her head. Then Daniel reached toward the small recorder on the table, and I recorded those conversations. Adrian's eyes widened. The room became completely silent as the weight of Daniel's words settled over everyone present. The man they believed to be helpless had been watching and listening the entire time. And now the truth had finally come to the light. The living room remained frozen in silence after Daniel revealed the truth. No one seemed able to move or even speak. The man they believed had been helpless for weeks was now sitting in front of them with calm, steady eyes. Adrian was the first to recover from the shock. This doesn't make sense," he said, trying to control the panic rising in his voice. "Why would you do something like this to your own family?" Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "I already told you why. I needed to know who truly cared about me and who only cared about what I owned." Marco ran a hand across his face, still trying to process what had just happened. "So, all this time," he said slowly, "you've been pretending?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Aunt Lorna looked deeply uncomfortable. "But the doctor confirmed it," she said weakly. Daniel gave a small nod. "He helped me carry out the plan." The room fell quiet again. Adrian's face slowly hardened as he realized the situation was turning against him. "You can't accuse us of anything," he said defensively. "We were only trying to help manage the company while you were sick." Daniel reached toward the small recorder resting on the coffee table. "Then perhaps you can explain this." He pressed a button. The room instantly filled with the sound of Adrian's voice. "We can't keep waiting forever. If we move carefully, we could gradually sell some company shares and manage the money ourselves." Another voice followed, clearly Marco's. "You mean without Daniel knowing?" Then Adrian's reply echoed through the room. "He can't see the documents anyway. If we tell him the business needs restructuring, he'll probably sign whatever papers we put in front of him." The recording continued for several more seconds before Daniel turned it off. No one dared to speak. The words hung heavily in the air. Adrian's confidence had completely vanished. That was taken out of context," he said quickly. Daniel slowly shook his head. "There's more." He placed several folders on the table. These contain financial records from the past few weeks. Every transfer, every account change, every canceled contract. Maria looked at the papers in surprise. "You've been monitoring everything?" Daniel nodded. "I had help from trusted executives in the company." He looked directly at Adrian. "You thought you were quietly moving money between accounts." Adrian's face turned pale, but every transaction was documented. Marco slowly sank back into his chair. Aunt Lorna avoided Daniel's gaze completely. Daniel continued speaking, his voice calm but firm. "While you were busy planning how to take control of the company, the employees were struggling to keep the business running." He turned his eyes toward the rest of the family. Drivers were worried about their salaries, suppliers were waiting for payments, contracts were canceled without proper planning. Adrian tried to interrupt again. "I was trying to stabilize the company." Daniel shook his head. "You were trying to control it." The room fell silent again. Then Daniel spoke more quietly. "For weeks, I listened to your conversations. I heard how you talked about me as if I were already gone." Marco's voice sounded small. "We didn't mean it like that." Daniel looked at him steadily. "You discussed sending me to a care facility so you could run everything yourselves." No one responded. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "The test was simple. I wanted to know how people would treat me when they believed I had become weak." He paused for a moment. "And now I know." Adrian's frustration finally erupted. "You tricked us," he snapped. Daniel remained calm. "No, I revealed you." The room felt heavier with every passing second. Finally, Daniel stood slowly from his chair. "There will be consequences for what you tried to do." He picked up one of the folders. "These documents have already been reviewed by my lawyer." Adrian's eyes widened. "Lawyer?" "Yes." Daniel placed the folder back on the table. "From this moment forward, none of you will have any authority over my company or financial accounts." Marco looked nervous. "You can't just throw us out." Daniel met his gaze calmly. "I can." The words were not loud, but they carried absolute certainty. "You were trusted members of this family. Instead, you chose greed." Aunt Lorna finally spoke, her voice trembling. "We made mistakes." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "you did." Then he added calmly, "And now you will have to face the consequences of those choices." The room fell silent once more, as everyone realized the situation had completely changed. The blind man they believed they could manipulate had been watching everything, and now their plans had collapsed in front of them. The heavy silence in the living room lingered, even after Daniel finished speaking. No one dared to argue anymore. The truth had already been exposed too clearly, and the evidence lying on the table left little room for excuses. Adrian sat stiffly in his chair, his earlier confidence completely gone. Marco stared at the floor, while Aunt Lorna quietly wiped tears from her eyes. The atmosphere that once felt like a normal family gathering had turned into something entirely different. Daniel slowly looked around the room. For a moment, he simply observed the people who had shared his home for weeks, people he once believed would always stand by him. The calm expression on his face never changed, but inside he felt a mixture of disappointment and acceptance. The test he created had already revealed everything he needed to know. After a long pause, Daniel finally spoke again. "This situation does not have to become uglier than it already is," he said quietly, "but things will change starting today." Everyone listened carefully. "I have already spoken with my lawyer and the board of executives in the company. The financial accounts have been secured. Any transactions made without my authorization have been frozen and reviewed." Adrian's shoulders dropped slightly as he heard this. "The restructuring you attempted will not continue. The company will return to the leadership team that helped build it properly." Maria stood quietly near the doorway, watching everything unfold. She did not say anything, but the relief on her face was clear. Daniel then turned his attention back to the relatives sitting in the room. "As for the family situation," he said calmly, "I will not pursue legal charges for what happened here." Several heads lifted in surprise. Adrian looked confused. "You won't?" he asked cautiously. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, I will not turn this into a criminal case." There was a small wave of relief among some of the relatives, but Daniel raised a hand before anyone could speak further. "However, that does not mean there will be no consequences." His voice remained steady. Starting tomorrow, everyone who moved into this house during the past months will need to find their own place to live. The room became tense again. Marco looked up nervously. "You're asking us to leave?" "Yes," Daniel replied calmly. "This house will no longer be used as a place where people stay simply because it is convenient." Adrian opened his mouth as if to argue, but Daniel continued before he could speak. Family should not remain together only when money is involved. No one responded. Daniel continued speaking in the same calm tone. "You all have your own lives, your own responsibilities. It is time for you to focus on those." Aunt Lorna lowered her head. "We truly regret what happened," she whispered. Daniel looked at her quietly. Regret often comes after people realize they've been caught. His words were not harsh, but they carried an undeniable truth. Then Daniel turned slightly toward Maria. "There are two people in this house who showed me what true loyalty looks like." Maria looked surprised when he said that. "Maria," Daniel said gently, "you defended me when you thought I was weak and helpless. You never tried to take advantage of my situation." Maria shook her head softly. "I only did what a sister should do." Daniel smiled faintly. "That is exactly why it matters." Then he looked toward the hallway where Rosa had quietly been standing, listening to the conversation from a distance. "Rosa," Daniel called softly. The elderly housemaid slowly stepped into the living room, looking slightly nervous. "Yes, sir?" Daniel walked toward her and spoke with warmth in his voice. "You treated me with kindness even when you believed I had nothing left to offer." Rosa shook her head humbly. "I only did my job." Daniel smiled. "No, you showed loyalty." Then he turned back to the others in the room. "Starting next month, Rosa will retire from her duties here, but she will continue living comfortably because I will personally provide for her." Rosa's eyes widened with surprise. "Sir, you don't have to do that." Daniel shook his head. "I want to." The room remained quiet as everyone watched the exchange. Then Daniel faced the relatives one final time. "I hope all of you learned something from what happened here," he said calmly. "Money can reveal the true character of people faster than anything else." He paused for a moment before continuing. "When someone is strong and successful, everyone wants to stand beside them. But the real test comes when that person appears weak." Daniel's eyes slowly moved across the room. "That is when you discover who truly values you as a human being." No one argued with him. The truth had already spoken for itself. That evening, the house slowly returned to silence as people began packing their belongings and preparing to leave. The large rooms that had once been crowded with relatives would soon feel empty again. But Daniel did not feel lonely, because now he understood something important. Wealth could attract many people, but loyalty was far more rare. And from that day forward, Daniel chose to surround himself only with those who valued him, not for the fortune he built, but for the man he truly was.